Gideon Blackwell didn't ride to Silver Ridge Ranch that morning to negotiate. He rode to deliver a message. He stopped his horse at the edge of Vivian Ashcroft's north fence line, looked at the three ranch hands working the cattle pens, and spoke loud enough for all of them to hear. "Tell your boss she's got 60 days before the bank calls her loans. Tell her I already spoke to Judge Harlan. Tell her the water rights on the Eastern Springs are being contested, and she'll lose." He paused, letting each word settle like a stone dropping into still water. "And tell her that when a woman tries to run a ranch this size alone, the land always ends up in smarter hands." He turned his horse and rode away without looking back. None of the three hands said a word. They didn't have to. If this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens next, because this one is going to stay with you. Now let's get into it. The morning Gideon Blackwell delivered his message to her fence line, Vivian Ashcroft was standing in the kitchen of the main house, reading a letter she'd already read 4 times. It was from the Territorial Bank of Cheyenne, not the branch manager she'd worked with for 11 years. Someone new. A name she didn't recognize. The letter was polite in the way that threats often are when they come from people wearing suits instead of guns. It informed her that her outstanding loan, secured against the eastern quarter of Silver Ridge, was under review. A full audit of the ranch's assets had been requested. She would need to make herself available within 30 days. She set the letter on the table and poured herself a second cup of coffee. She didn't drink. She was 57 years old. She had run this ranch through 2 droughts, one catastrophic winter, a cattle disease that wiped out nearly a third of her herd, and the death of her husband, Thomas Ashcroft, 18 months ago. She had not cried in front of a single employee since Thomas died, and she did not intend to start now. But her hands were not entirely steady when she set the cup down. Nora, her housekeeper of 14 years, came in from the side door and looked at the letter on the table without touching it. "That's the second one this month," Nora said. "Third." Vivian turned toward the window. "The first one I didn't tell anyone about." Nora was quiet for a moment. She was 61, with gray-streaked hair and the kind of face that had absorbed enough hard years to stop flinching at new ones. She pulled a chair out and sat down uninvited, which was something she'd earned the right to do. "What are you going to do?" "What I always do." Vivian picked up her hat from the hook beside the door. "Go to work." She walked out before Nora could say anything else. Silver Ridge Ranch covered just over 14,000 acres of Wyoming high country. Thomas Ashcroft had built it from 4,000 acres over 30 years, buying land carefully, negotiating water rights shrewdly, and cultivating relationships with the railroad agents who controlled the freight routes north. When he died, thrown from a horse, the coroner said, though Vivian had never fully believed that explanation, he left her a working empire. He also left her alone in it. The ranch employed 22 full-time hands, 3 foremen, a cook, and Nora. It ran 1,200 head of cattle. It had 2 wells, access to 3 natural springs, and a contract with the Northern Pacific Line that moved product to market faster than any competitor in the territory. On paper, Silver Ridge was untouchable. That was what Vivian had believed until 8 months ago when the first strange thing happened. Martin Reeves, her most reliable foreman, a man who had worked the ranch since Thomas's early years, resigned without notice. He left a 1-paragraph letter on her desk and was gone before she woke up that morning. He had taken no property, no severance, nothing. He simply left. She'd tried to reach him twice. He never replied. 3 weeks later, the fencing on the north quarter came down in 3 separate sections over a single night. Not wind damage, cut wire. Her cattle drifted 6 miles before anyone caught them. She lost 4 animals and spent 2 weeks repairing what had taken years to establish. Then a water dispute surfaced from nowhere. A land agent she'd never heard of filed a claim that the Eastern Springs, springs that had fed Silver Ridge for 30 years, crossed a survey boundary that predated Thomas's original deed. The paperwork was a tangle, and untangling it cost her $4,000 and 3 months of correspondence before a territorial court sided with her. Each incident, taken alone, looked like ordinary misfortune. Ranch life was full of misfortune. Fences broke. Water rights got disputed. Good men left for better opportunities. But Vivian was not a woman who believed in patterns forming by accident. She had said nothing to anyone, Not to her remaining foreman, not to her attorney, not to the banker she still trusted. And there were fewer of those now. She kept her suspicions private because she understood something Thomas had taught her early in their marriage. When someone is trying to make you look weak, the worst thing you can do is let them see that it's working. She saddled her horse alone that morning and rode the north fence line until she found the three hands who'd been working the pens when Blackwell came by. The youngest one, a boy named Ellis, barely 20, was the one who told her what Blackwell said. Word for word, because Ellis had a good memory and a deep dislike for injustice, and he'd been repeating it to himself since it happened. Vivian listened without moving. When Ellis finished, she looked at the fence line for a long moment. When was this? Hour ago, ma'am? Maybe a little more? Did he leave anyone behind? Any riders lingering on the road? No, ma'am. He came alone, left alone. She nodded slowly. You did right telling me. She turned her horse and rode back toward the main house at a pace that was unhurried enough to suggest she wasn't alarmed, and fast enough that Ellis watched her go with a quiet, unsettled feeling in his chest. Gideon Blackwell had been trying to buy Silver Ridge Ranch for 7 years. The first offer came when Thomas was still alive, a number that was generous enough to be insulting because it implied Thomas was the kind of man who could be talked out of 30 years of work for the right price. Thomas had declined in writing, which was his way of making sure there was a record. After Thomas died, Blackwell came to Vivian directly. He arrived with his hat in hand and the manner of a man offering charity, and he named a figure that was lower than the first one. She showed him the door. He sent an intermediary 6 months later. Same answer. Now apparently he had moved to a different approach. Vivian sat at her desk that afternoon and wrote out everything she knew about the past 8 months. The foreman's resignation, the cut fences, the water dispute, the bank letters, Blackwell's appearance at her fence line that morning. She wrote it all out in a plain ledger, in her own handwriting, with dates. It covered 4 pages. She read it back and felt something settle in her chest that was colder and steadier than anger. This was not a string of bad luck. This was a campaign, systematic, patient, and carefully designed to look like ordinary misfortune until it wasn't, until Silver Ridge had bled enough that selling looked like survival instead of defeat. The question was how to fight something you couldn't fully see. She was still sitting at that desk when, 3 hours later, one of the hands came to the door with a look on his face that she'd learned to read quickly. Not danger, something else. Uncertainty. Ma'am, there's a horse at the front gate. Whose horse? That's the thing. He paused. There's a man on it. He's not in good shape. She heard him before she saw him. Not his voice, his breathing. It was the kind of breathing that happened when a person had been fighting pain long enough that the body had given up protesting and was simply working to continue. He was slumped forward over the saddle, one hand gripping the horn, the other hanging loose at his side. His coat was dark with what could have been mud along the left shoulder but wasn't. The horse had stopped at the gate on its own and stood perfectly still, which told Vivian something about the animal. Patient, well-trained, the kind of horse a careful man chose deliberately. She walked toward the gate. 2 of her hands moved instinctively to step ahead of her. She passed them without breaking stride. The man lifted his head when he heard her approach. He was somewhere in his early 40s, lean in the way that came from hard living rather than scarcity. Dark hair, badly in need of cutting, 3 or 4 days of growth on his jaw. His eyes, when they focused on her, were a particular shade of gray that reminded her of sky before a serious storm, alert in a way the rest of him wasn't. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the 2 hands behind her, then back at her. I'm not here to make trouble, he said. His voice was rough but deliberate. I'd appreciate a drink of water, and then I'll move on. You're bleeding through your coat, she said. I know. How long? He thought about it. Since yesterday morning. She studied him. He wasn't reaching for the revolver she could see holstered at his hip. He wasn't scanning the gate for an entry point. He sat on that horse with the stillness of a man who was genuinely too tired to pretend, too tired to be calculating, too tired to perform the kind of harmlessness that actually alarmed her in strangers. What she saw was a man who had made a decision. He'd come to this gate instead of pushing on. That was either desperation or judgment. She wasn't certain which. Open the gate, she said. The hand to her left, a heavy-set man named Corbett, who had worked Silver Ridge for 9 years and felt protective of it accordingly, turned to look at her. Ma'am, Corbett, He opened the gate. They got him off the horse in the yard. He allowed this with minimal resistance, which meant he was worse off than he looked. The bullet had gone in through the back of his left shoulder, and she could see when they got his coat off, hadn't come out. A ranch this size had dealt with enough injuries that Vivian kept medical supplies that most people would have found excessive. She had done minor surgery herself, once, when a hand had a broken arm, and the nearest doctor was 40 miles away in a blizzard. She sent for clean water and her kit, and she did what needed to be done while he sat in the chair in the bunkhouse, jaw set, not making a sound. He answered her questions in short sentences. His name was Cole Maddox. He was passing through. He'd run into trouble on the road. Bandits, he said, though the word came out slightly too flat, slightly too prepared. Bandits usually take a man's horse, she said, not looking up from what she was doing. They tried. So you outran them. Something like that. She finished, looked up, and met his eyes. That's not the whole story. It wasn't a question. He looked at her steadily for a moment. No, he said, it's not. All right. She began rolling gauze. You don't have to tell me the rest yet, but I'll need to know eventually, because whatever you brought with you, it's sharing a roof with my people, and that matters to me. He was quiet for a moment. That's fair, he said. It was, she thought, a reasonable response from a man who could have lied. Nora fed him broth and bread, and he ate it without complaint, which told Vivian he was hungry in the bone-deep way that came from days of pushing without stopping. She put him in the small room off the bunkhouse, not the main house, not yet, and told Corbett to keep an eye on the gate. She went back to her desk and looked at the 4 pages she'd written. Then she looked at the door. Then she picked up her pen and added a 5th page. At the top she wrote 1 line, "What I don't know yet." She left it blank for now. Cole Maddox slept for 14 hours. When he woke, he sat up too fast, reached for his revolver, which wasn't where he'd left it, and was on his feet before the pain brought him back to himself. He stood in the small room breathing carefully, looking at the unfamiliar walls, and let his memory catch up with him. The ranch, the woman at the gate, the chair, the needle. He sat back down on the edge of the cot and stayed there for a minute, putting together the kind of assessment he'd trained himself to make automatically. Small room, 1 window. Door opened inward. No lock. He could see his coat on the hook by the door, and his revolver was on the table across the room, placed there deliberately, visible, within reach, but not immediately at hand. Someone had thought about that. Whether to take it and decided not to. Whether to leave it close and decided not to. They'd left it where he'd have to make a choice to go get it. He thought about that while he put his boots on. Corbett was outside the door. He was not exactly friendly, but he stepped back to give Cole room and said, "She's at breakfast. Nora said to bring you when you're up." Cole followed him to the main house. He moved carefully. The shoulder had stiffened overnight and reminded him of this at every step. And he used the walk to look at the layout of the yard. The barns, the position of the gate, the sight lines. Not because he was planning anything, because looking was how he'd always worked. It was a habit older than he cared to think about. The kitchen was warm. Vivian Ashcroft was at the table with a cup of coffee and a stack of papers, and she didn't shuffle the papers away when he came in. She looked at him, looked at the way he was moving, and said, "Sit down before you fall down." He sat. Nora put coffee in front of him, then food, and he thanked her and ate while Vivian drank her coffee and didn't press him. After a while, she said, "I need to ask you something." "All right." "The men who shot you, are they likely to come looking for you here?" He considered how to answer this honestly without answering it completely. And then he looked at her and understood that this woman had been taking measure of people for a long time, and that a partial answer would not satisfy her. "I don't know," he said. "That's the truth. I don't know how close they are or whether they tracked me this far. I've been careful, but I can't promise you I brought nothing with me." She nodded slowly. "Then I need you to tell me what I'm dealing with." "You said I didn't have to tell you yet. That was last night. This morning I need to make decisions about my ranch, and I can't do that with gaps in information." She held his gaze. "So I'll ask you once directly. Who's after you and how dangerous are they?" He set his fork down. He looked at the table for a moment, and then he looked at her. "Dangerous enough that I've been running for 2 years, he said. "Not because I'm afraid of them, because fighting them would have cost more than I was willing to pay alone." "And now?" He paused. And now I'm sitting at your table, which I didn't plan. No one plans their way into my kitchen bleeding. She picked up her coffee. What's your real name? He went very still. She raised an eyebrow. Cole Maddox. That's not a name a person is born with. I've been reading people long enough to know the names we pick for ourselves from the names we're given. The silence in the kitchen stretched out for a few seconds. Cole's real, he said finally. The last name is borrowed. What's the one you were born with? He looked at her. He looked at Nora, who had moved to the far end of the kitchen and was pretending not to listen. He looked back at Vivian. Calloway, he said quietly. Cole Calloway. She didn't react the way he expected. She didn't show recognition, didn't draw back, didn't pick up her papers again. She just looked at him with that level gaze and said, "All right, Cole Calloway, drink your coffee." He did. He asked about the ranch. Not intrusively. He asked the way someone asks when they genuinely want to understand a place rather than assess it. She answered carefully at first, and then more fully, because there was something in the quality of his questions that surprised her. He asked about the water sources, about the fencing configuration on the north quarter, about how the railroad contracts were structured. "You're not asking like a cowboy," she said. "No," he agreed. He didn't elaborate. She let it go. For now. By afternoon, he was well enough to walk the yard without looking like he might collapse. And he did, slowly, with Corbett trailing him at a discreet distance that fooled no one. He looked at the fence lines he could see from the yard. He looked at the water trough configuration. He looked at the position of the bunkhouse relative to the main gate. At dinner, he sat at the table in the kitchen again. Nora had apparently decided this was where he was eating, and neither of them challenged it. And when Vivian came in from the office, he was already there, and he had a piece of paper in front of him covered in neat, small writing. She sat down, looked at the paper, looked at him. "What is that?" "Things I noticed today." He turned it so she could read it. She read it. She read it again. The paper listed 6 specific observations about Silver Ridge Ranch. The angle of the cut marks on the repaired north fence section, not tearing, clean cuts, suggesting a tool rather than wire fatigue. The eastern trough running at approximately 2/3 capacity, inconsistent with natural spring output this time of year. An invoice pinned to the board in the equipment barn showing a supply purchase that was 30% above market rate from a vendor she likely hadn't personally approved. A section of track near the cattle pen that showed wear patterns inconsistent with normal use, suggesting livestock were being moved at night when the ground was softer. She set the paper down. "How long were you in the yard today?" she asked. 4 hours. "My foremen have been here for years." "Yes," he said simply. She was quiet for a moment. "Cole Calloway, what did you do before you borrowed a last name and started sleeping in other people's bunkhouses?" He looked at her steadily. "I found things," he said. "Things people didn't want found." It started raining that night, a hard, cold Wyoming rain that hit the roof of the main house like it had something to prove. Vivian sat at her desk until well past midnight, reading the 4 pages she'd written and then reading his 6 observations and putting them together the way you put together pieces of something you'd broken and were now trying to understand. She'd known Silver Ridge was under attack. What she hadn't understood until tonight was how precise the attack was. Whoever was behind this understood her ranch at a structural level. The water supplies, the vendor relationships, the employee loyalties, the banking structure. Each pressure point chosen carefully, each move designed not to destroy immediately, but to erode. Like water finding its way through rock. Patient, persistent, invisible, until the damage was already done. And now a man had arrived at her gate with a bullet in his shoulder and eyes that saw in 4 hours what her people hadn't caught in months. She didn't believe in coincidence. She never had. But she wasn't sure yet what she believed this was instead. The rain got harder. She turned off the lamp and listened to it for a while in the dark. And then she picked up her pen and wrote 1 sentence at the bottom of the 5th page, the one she'd left blank. "I don't know what he is yet, but I think he might be what this ranch needs." She closed the ledger and went to bed. Outside, the gate held against the rain. The horses were settled in the barn. The hands were in the bunkhouse. And in the small room off the bunkhouse, Cole Calloway lay on his back staring at the ceiling, listening to the same rain, thinking about how long he'd been running and how strange it was that the place where he'd finally stopped felt, against every instinct he'd trained himself to trust, like somewhere he could breathe. He didn't know what that meant yet. He was fairly sure it meant something. The rain came down. Silver Ridge held, as it had always held, against the weather. What it had not yet held against was the man in town who had decided it was already his. That was the problem. And that was what neither of them, not Vivian at her desk, not Cole in his borrowed room, had yet found a way to solve. But morning was coming, and in the morning things would begin to move faster than either of them was ready for. The morning after the rain, Cole was up before anyone else. Vivian found him in the equipment barn when she came out at first light, standing in front of the supply board where the invoice he'd noted was still pinned. He had a lantern in his left hand. He was favoring the right side still, the shoulder making itself known with every movement. And he was reading the invoice the way she'd seen lawyers read contracts, slowly and with a particular quality of attention that looked almost like suspicion. He didn't hear her come in, or if he did, he didn't show it. "That vendor," she said, and he turned without startling, which told her he'd known she was there. "Hollis Supply, out of Laramie. Thomas used them for years." "When did the pricing change?" She came to stand beside him, looked at the invoice. "I'd have to check the records." "You should." He unpinned the invoice and handed it to her. "That rate is 31% above what Hollis was charging operations this size 18 months ago. I know because I've seen their invoices before." She looked at him sideways. "You've seen Hollis Supply invoices." "I've seen a lot of invoices." He said it without apology, without elaboration, in the tone of someone stating a fact they don't intend to explain yet. She took the invoice. She didn't argue. She went back to the house and pulled out 2 years of supply records from the filing cabinet in Thomas's old office, her office now, though she still sometimes thought of it as his, and sat down with a cup of coffee that went cold while she worked through the numbers. Cole was right. The pricing had shifted 14 months ago, not all at once, incrementally, a few percent here, a few there, the kind of change that looked like ordinary inflation unless you were comparing it against a baseline. And none of her foremen had flagged it, because none of her foremen had thought to compare it against a baseline. She put the papers down and sat with that for a while. 14 months ago, 2 months before the first strange incident, Martin Reeves's resignation. She wrote it in the ledger. Cole spent the morning working. Not ranch work. He was in no condition for heavy physical labor and made no pretense otherwise, but the kind of work that involved going through things carefully. She gave him access to the equipment barn records after he asked, and she watched from across the yard as he sat on an overturned crate with a stack of ledgers, reading through them with that same particular attention. Corbett found her watching. "You trusted him?" Corbett said. It wasn't quite accusatory, more like a man checking the weather before deciding what coat to wear. "Not yet," she said. "I trust what he noticed yesterday. That's a different thing. He could be working for Blackwell." "He could." She'd thought about that. A man working for Blackwell wouldn't point out the inflated invoices. "He'd let me keep paying them." Corbett considered this. It was the kind of logic he couldn't argue with, which didn't mean it made him comfortable. "I don't like not knowing where he came from," Corbett said. "Neither do I." She turned from the barn. "Keep watching." "Yes, ma'am." She went back inside. Lunch was where things shifted. Nora had made a proper meal, stew, bread, dried apple pie that was better than it had any right to be given the time of year, and Cole came to the table looking like a man who'd been doing hard thinking for 4 hours. He sat down, ate a few spoonfuls, and then put his spoon down and looked at Vivian. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly." "I generally do," she said. "Your husband, Thomas Ashcroft, the way he died." He paused. "Do you believe it was an accident?" The kitchen went very quiet. Nora, at the counter, stopped moving. Vivian set her spoon down. She looked at Cole for a long moment. The question was not one she'd expected, and it was not one she'd have answered for most people, and she thought about that for a moment, about why she was considering answering it now, for this man she'd known for less than 2 days. Because he asked it directly, she decided, without softening it or approaching it sideways. That was worth something. "No," she said. "I don't." Cole nodded slowly. He didn't look surprised. "Thomas was an experienced horseman," she continued, and the words came out steadier than she expected. "He'd been riding since he was 8 years old, The horse that threw him was one he'd owned for 6 years, a horse he knew perfectly. The ground where it happened was flat, dry, no gopher holes, no rocks. She picked up her spoon again, then put it back down. The coroner said the horse spooked. I asked what spooked it. He said he didn't know. Did anyone examine the saddle? She looked at him sharply. What? The saddle. After a fall like that, was the tack examined? Her mouth was slightly open. She closed it. I don't think so. The coroner examined Thomas. The hand saw to the horse. And the saddle? She stopped, thought back. I don't know. I wasn't. She shook her head. I wasn't in a state to think about the saddle. Of course you weren't. He said it plainly, without condescension. Most people aren't. That's the point. She stared at him. What are you saying? I'm not saying anything definite. I'm asking whether anyone looked. He held her gaze. Because what's happening to your ranch right now, the precision of it, the patience of it, this isn't the work of someone who acts impulsively. This is someone who plans ahead, someone who's been planning for a long time. The stew sat between them getting cold. Nora had turned around from the counter and was looking at Cole with an expression that was something between alarm and the particular recognition of a person who has suspected something for a long time and just heard someone else say it out loud. Vivian picked up her coffee. Her hand was perfectly steady. She'd decided, somewhere in the back of her mind, that she was not going to let this conversation make her hands unsteady. His name is Gideon Blackwell, she said. He's been trying to buy this ranch for 7 years. Cole looked at her. Something shifted in his face. Not surprise exactly. More like a piece sliding into place. Tell me about him, he said. She did. All of it. The offers, the declining prices, the intermediary, and then what Blackwell had said at her fence line yesterday morning. She told it without editorializing, in sequence, the way she'd written it in the ledger. When she finished, Cole was quiet for a long moment. Gideon Blackwell, he said, half to himself. You know him? I know the name. He looked at the table. Or I know a name connected to that name. Someone who operates the same way. He was choosing his words carefully now, and she could see the choosing. There's a method to this kind of operation. Systematic pressure, applied across multiple points simultaneously, designed to look like bad luck until the target is too weakened to fight back. It's not common because it requires resources and patience. Most men who want something just take it. He looked up. The ones who do it this way are the more dangerous kind. Because they're harder to prove, she said. Because by the time you can prove it, you've already lost. The kitchen held that for a moment. Then we'd better not lose, Vivian said. She gave him the ledger that afternoon. All 5 pages, everything she'd recorded, including the 5th page with the one sentence at the bottom. He read it without comment until he got to the end. Then he looked up at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. You wrote this the night I arrived, he said. Yes. You already knew the shape of it before I said anything. I knew something was wrong. I didn't know what I was looking at. She sat across from him at the desk. You named it. Naming it isn't the same as stopping it. No, she agreed, but it's a start. He looked at the ledger again. Then he set it on the desk and leaned back in the chair, carefully, compensating for the shoulder, and looked at the ceiling for a moment in the way of a person trying to see the whole picture. I need to get into town, he said. You're not in any condition to— Not today. In a few days. He looked at her. There are things I need to look at that aren't on this ranch. County records, land filings, water rights documentation at the courthouse. He paused. And I need to look at the bank. The territorial bank? Whoever sent that audit request isn't doing it independently. Someone asked them to. Someone with either money or influence, and Blackwell has both. He sat forward. I want to see who's been in contact with that branch. You can't exactly walk into a bank and ask to see their correspondence. He looked at her with the faint expression of a person who finds this statement almost charming in its innocence. No, he said, I can't. He didn't explain further. She didn't push. 3 days passed. Cole's shoulder improved faster than it had any right to, which Vivian attributed to stubbornness, since she couldn't think of another medical explanation. He moved through those 3 days quietly, eating at the kitchen table, reading through whatever records she gave him access to, walking the ranch yard in the evenings when the light was flat and the hands were at supper. He'd found his way into conversations with some of the hands. Not in a way that was obvious or engineered, more like it happened naturally, the way conversations do when someone is simply present and attentive long enough. By the second day, Ellis was talking to him like they'd known each other a year. By the third, even Corbett had exchanged more than a dozen words with him, which was Corbett's equivalent of a warm welcome. Vivian watched this from appropriate distances and thought about it. She'd known ranch people all her adult life. She'd known cattlemen, lawyers, bankers, land agents, one territorial judge, and two of his predecessors. She'd watched her husband navigate men, which Thomas had done by being straightforward and fair, and she'd watched Blackwell navigate men, which he did by finding what they wanted and offering an approximation of it. Cole did neither. He simply paid attention, and people apparently found that sufficient reason to trust him. She wasn't sure whether that made him remarkable or simply unusual. On the third evening, she was in the office when he knocked on the open door. "You found something," she said without looking up. "How do you know?" "You knock differently when you have something to say." He came in and sat in the chair across the desk. He had one of the supply ledgers open to a page she recognized. "You're missing water," he said. "Eastern Springs. You told the court it was a survey boundary dispute. That's what was filed. We fought it and won. You fought the filing. That's different." He put the ledger on the desk, turned so she could see the page. He'd been making small marks in pencil, light enough to erase, beside certain entries. "Your water output has been below normal for 8 months, not dramatically. A trough that should fill to a certain level filling to 90, 85, 80%, gradual. Wells have variation, not springs. Springs are consistent unless something changes upstream." He pointed to the page. "Someone has been diverting water from the source. Not enough to stop your supply. That would be too obvious. Just enough to reduce it slowly. Keep your cattle slightly underwatered. Reduce your herd's condition gradually over time. When you go to sell, the cattle weigh less than expected, the buyer gets less than expected, and your revenue drops without any single incident you can point to." She looked at the page, looked at his pencil marks, looked back at him. "How do you divert a spring?" she asked. "You don't need much. A partial blockage upstream, redirected through a secondary channel onto adjacent land. Done carefully, it looks like natural variation." He met her eyes. "The adjacent land on the eastern boundary is owned by a land company out of Cheyenne." "I know. The land company filed the original water claim." "The land company is a holding entity. It was formed 19 months ago." He paused. 8 months before Thomas died. The office was very quiet. Vivian looked at the ledger page for a long time. Then she looked at Cole. "You got all of this from my supply records," she said, "and from thinking about what I wasn't seeing." He leaned forward. "Whoever set this up knew your operation well. Not the way a competitor knows a competitor from a distance. The way someone knows a place who's been inside it. Thomas trusted Blackwell about as far as he could throw him. Blackwell was never inside this operation. Maybe not Blackwell directly." He watched her. "Who else had access to your records? Your banking relationship? Your vendor contracts? Your water documentation?" She was already thinking through the list before he finished the question. It was not a long list. Her attorney. Her bank manager, the old one, Morrison, who'd retired a year ago. The foreman. And Martin Reeves, who'd known Silver Ridge's accounts as well as Thomas had, and who had left without explanation and never answered her letters. She said Reeves's name out loud and watched Cole's face. He didn't look surprised, which meant he'd already gotten there. "I need to find Martin Reeves," she said. "Yes," he agreed, "but carefully." The following morning brought a different kind of trouble. A rider came to the gate at 8 o'clock. Not one of her hands, not a familiar face. I was a young man, tidy, with the nervous energy of someone delivering news he hadn't written and wasn't sure he agreed with. He had an envelope with the seal of the Territorial Bank of Cheyenne, and he asked for Mrs. Ashcroft by name. Vivian read the letter at the kitchen table while Cole stood at the window looking at the yard. The audit timeline had been moved up. She was now required to present 30 months of financial records for review within 2 weeks, not 30 days. A bank representative would arrive at Silver Ridge in 10 days to conduct the on-site portion of the assessment. She folded the letter and put it face down on the table. "They're accelerating," Cole said. Yes. Something changed. They moved faster than they planned. He turned from the window, which means something we've been doing worried someone. She thought about that. In the past 3 days, she'd pulled records, she'd cross-referenced invoices, and the records I pulled from the filing cabinet, she said slowly, Thomas's old files, 2 years of supply records. Someone saw you pull them? Corbett was in the hall. It's not, he wouldn't. She shook her head. But if someone in town has been watching for signs that I'm looking more closely at the accounts, they'd want to move before you found something actionable. Cole sat down at the table. That's not bad news. She looked at him. A 2-week deadline feels like bad news. It means they're scared of what you might find. He held her gaze. Scared people make mistakes. We need to be ready for that. She didn't particularly find this comforting, but she recognized it as accurate, which was a different thing. What do we do? First, we get those 30 months of records organized before they arrive, and we make sure every number is documented and sourced. We don't give them anything ambiguous to use against you. He was already thinking ahead of his words, she could tell. She'd started to recognize the cadence. Second, I go to town today. Your shoulder is manageable. He said it with the tone of someone closing a subject. I need to get to the courthouse before that bank representative has a reason to. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about what it meant to send a man with a borrowed name and an unexplained past into her county seat on her behalf. She thought about the 4 pages in the ledger and the 5 years she'd been running Silver Ridge while feeling the ground tilt beneath her feet. Take Ellis with you, she said. He knows people in town, and he's loyal. All right. And Cole. He turned back at the door. If anyone asks who you are, what do you tell them? He thought about it for just a second. A ranch hand, doing an errand for Mrs. Ashcroft. Good. She picked up the bank letter again. That's exactly what you are. Something crossed his face. Not offense, not humor exactly. Something in between. Yes, ma'am, he said. They left for town mid-morning. Vivian watched them ride out from the front porch. Cole and Ellis side by side, Cole sitting his horse carefully because of the shoulder but without obvious strain. And then she went inside and started pulling records. She pulled every supply invoice for the past 30 months, every bank statement, every payroll record, every contract, every land filing, every water rights document. She stacked them in order on the dining table, which was the only surface large enough, and Nora helped her without being asked, which was how Nora showed care, not by saying things, but by being there. By early afternoon, the table was covered. This is everything, Nora said. Everything I could find. Vivian looked at the stacks. Thomas kept some records in the field ledgers. I'll need to get those from the barn. You think they'll find something wrong? Vivian was quiet for a moment. I think someone has been making things look wrong for a long time. Whether they actually are. She picked up the closest stack and began to read. That's what I intend to find out. Nora went to put on more coffee. She came back 20 minutes later and found Vivian at the table with 2 stacks separated from the rest, and a look on her face that was not quite anger, controlled beyond that, colder. What? Nora said. Vivian pointed to the smaller stack. These invoices. Hollis Supply. The inflated ones. Cole found those. Cole found one of them. I've been going through them all. She looked up. There are 47 invoices over 22 months. On 17 of them, the amount we paid doesn't match the amount on the original invoice. Nora frowned. What do you mean, doesn't match? Someone altered the invoices after payment, changed the numbers, made it look like we were paying the correct amount when actually we were paying more. The ranch ledger shows the higher payment. The invoice shows a lower number. She set the papers down. If anyone looks at our records the wrong way, if they assume the invoices are accurate and our ledger entries are fabrications, it looks like we've been falsifying accounts, skimming money from our own operation. Nora sat down. That would give the bank grounds to do almost anything they wanted, demand full repayment of all outstanding loans, call the terms of the railroad contract into question, potentially move for a court-appointed administrator to manage the ranch's assets. Vivian's voice was very flat and very clear, which would give Blackwell's people access to the operation through the court system instead of through a sale. They looked at each other across the table. How long has this been in the records? Nora asked. Since month 7 of the altered pricing. Vivian pressed both hands flat on the table, something she did when she needed to feel solid ground. For 15 months, these records have been sitting in my filing cabinet, making me look like a criminal. The afternoon light was coming through the windows at a low angle, cutting across the table and the stacks of paper. Outside, the ranch was going on as ranches do, the ordinary sounds of animals and work and weather. None of it knew what was happening at the dining table. "Can it be fixed?" Nora said carefully. "It can be documented. Original payments can be verified through the bank's own records if you know where to look and you file the right requests." Vivian straightened. "But we'd need access to the bank's own transaction records, not just ours. We'd need someone who understood how to pull that kind of documentation through official channels." She paused. "Someone who's done it before." She was looking at the door when she said that last part, the direction Cole and Ellis had ridden that morning. They came back at dusk, both of them windburned and quieter than they'd left. Ellis went to the bunkhouse. Cole came to the main house and stood in the doorway of the dining room looking at the table for a moment. "You found it," he said. "The altered invoices." "Yes." She watched his face. "You knew they'd be there." "I suspected." He came to the table, looked at the separated stack. 17. Over 22 months. He nodded. He didn't look surprised, and she didn't expect him to. "What did you find in town?" she said. He pulled out a folded piece of paper from his coat. He'd worn a different coat today, one of the hands that fit him poorly across the shoulders, and set it on the table beside her stacks. It was a handwritten list. County records. Land filings. Specific dates. "The holding company that filed the water claim," he said. "Keystone Land Holdings. Registered in Cheyenne 19 months ago. Listed agent is an attorney named Pryor. Rutherford Pryor." He looked at her. "He also filed the amended survey claim on your eastern boundary 6 months ago." "I know Pryor. He handles Blackwell's commercial filings." "He handles more than that." Cole pointed to the second item on his list. "There's a second holding entity. Newer. Registered 8 months ago. Called Prairie Basin Acquisitions. Listed agent is a different name, but the filing address is the same office building as Pryor's practice." He looked up. "Prairie Basin Acquisitions holds a note on one of Blackwell's neighboring ranches, a small operation, family-owned, that had trouble with a water dispute about a year ago. That ranch had trouble. The same kind of trouble you've been having. Water reduced. Invoices inflated. A bank loan recalled ahead of schedule. I was watching her absorb this. They sold. 8 months ago, the family sold to Prairie Basin Acquisitions for 40 cents on the dollar." Vivian stood very still. "It's a method," Cole said quietly. "Not improvised. Not specific to you. It's a tested, repeatable process for acquiring land from people who don't have the resources to fight a coordinated attack across multiple fronts." He put both hands on the table. "And the only way to fight a method is to understand it completely before they finish using it on you." "How do you know all of this?" she said. He looked at her. In the fading light, his expression was direct and without performance. "Because I've seen it before," he said. "In a different territory. Different names. Same method." He paused. "And the last time I encountered it, I didn't move fast enough." She waited. He had more to say. She could see it. "The man I was working with, my partner, he got too close to the people running it. They found out before we could file the case." He looked at the list on the table. "He didn't survive it." The dining room held the silence that deserved. "I'm sorry," she said. Simple. No embellishment. It was enough. He nodded once. "I won't let that happen here," he said, "but I need you to trust me with something you haven't trusted anyone with before." She looked at him. "What?" "Everything. All of it. Whatever you know about Thomas's death. Whatever you've been protecting by keeping it private. Whatever you haven't said out loud because you were afraid of what it would start." He held her gaze. "I can't build a case with pieces. I need the whole thing." The room was very quiet. Outside, the last of the daylight was leaving the yard. Vivian looked at her ledger on the corner of the table. She looked at the stacks of records. She looked at this man who had arrived at her gate bleeding and who had, in 5 days, seen more clearly than anyone had in 18 months. Then she sat down and she started talking. She talked for 2 hours. Cole didn't interrupt. He sat across the table with his hands folded and let her go at her own pace, which was not the pace of someone recounting. It was the pace of someone excavating, pulling things up from places they'd been buried, not because burying them had been wrong at the time, but because keeping them down there any longer had started to cost more than she could afford. She told him about the morning Thomas died, how she'd woken at 5 and he was already gone from the bed, which was not unusual. Thomas was an early riser, always had been. How she'd heard the horse in the yard and assumed he was doing his customary dawn ride before breakfast. How the hand named Percy had come to the door 2 hours later with his hat in both hands and a look on his face she would never fully stop seeing. She told him the horse had come back without Thomas, that they'd found him in the north field, half a mile from the main gate, on ground that was flat and familiar. The horse was not injured. The saddle was still on. She remembered that detail now, with Cole's question ringing in her mind. But she hadn't thought to look at it. She'd been taken to where Thomas lay, and after that she remembered almost nothing about the physical details of the scene. She remembered only Thomas's face and the particular quality of stillness that was different from sleep, and Percy's voice saying her name over and over in the way people do when they want to bring someone back from somewhere. She told him about the coroner, a man named Aldous Fletcher, appointed by the county 3 years prior. Fletcher had examined Thomas quickly. She'd thought at the time that quickly meant there was nothing unusual to find. Now, sitting at the table with Cole Calloway across from her and 17 altered invoices in a stack to her left, quickly meant something different. She told him about Blackwell appearing at her door 6 weeks after the funeral. The condolences that lasted approximately 40 seconds before he produced a folded document from his coat that turned out to be a purchase offer. She told him about Martin Reeves, not just the resignation, but the 12 years before it. Reeves had been with the ranch since before she and Thomas married. He knew the operation as well as anyone alive. He had, in the last year of Thomas's life, begun making more trips to town than his work required. She'd noticed it but thought nothing of it. Ranches needed things from town. Foremen ran errands. She'd been busy with other concerns. She told him about the night, 6 months after Thomas died, when she'd gone into the ranch's secondary storage building to look for a specific land deed and found a crate of records she didn't recognize. Supply logs, mostly. She'd assumed they were outdated and put them aside, meaning to review them and never quite getting to it. 2 weeks later, the crate was gone. When she finished, the room was fully dark. Nora had come in at some point and lit the lamps without saying anything, then gone back to the kitchen. Cole sat for a moment. He'd been making small notes on the back of his list the whole time she talked, without looking at the paper. "The crate," he said. "You're sure it was in a place Reeves would have access to? He had keys to every building on this ranch. And it disappeared 2 weeks after you found it. I couldn't swear to the exact timing, but it was there and then it wasn't. Did you mention finding it to anyone between when you found it and when it disappeared?" She thought back. It was the kind of thinking that took a moment, because the memory had been ordinary when it happened. No reason to fix it precisely. "Nora," she said finally. "I told Nora I'd found a crate of records I needed to go through when I had time." "In front of anyone else?" "I don't—" She stopped. "Corbett was in the kitchen when I said it. He was there for supper." Cole was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of accusation. She could read the difference. "I'm not suggesting Corbett told anyone intentionally," he said carefully. "But if someone in town had a standing arrangement with anyone on this ranch, payment for information, not loyalty, just information, a mention of an unexpected crate of records would be worth passing along." Vivian sat with that. She didn't like it. The discomfort of it was not suspicion of Corbett specifically. It was the more general discomfort of understanding that a campaign this careful would account for ordinary conversations, ordinary moments. That someone had turned the daily texture of her life into a source of intelligence against her. "Reeves," she said, "probably Reeves. But Reeves needed a reason to cooperate and a channel to communicate through." Cole set his pen down. "And he's been gone for over a year, which means whatever he knew about your operation, someone else has it now." She nodded slowly. "The coroner," Cole said. "Fletcher. Is he still in the county?" "Yes, he was reappointed last spring." "Who appoints him?" She met Cole's eyes. "The county judge. Harlan Bates." She watched Cole write the name down. She'd said it herself to Blackwell's message that morning at the fence. "I already spoke to Judge Harlan." She'd registered it then. Hearing Cole write it down made it more real in a way she hadn't been prepared for. "How deep does this go?" she said. It wasn't quite a question. Deep enough that we need to be careful about what we do next and in what order. He looked at his notes. Because if Blackwell has the coroner and the county judge, then going to local law with what we have right now is worse than doing nothing. The territorial level is possible, but we need more than we have before we go that high. A territorial investigation that doesn't result in charges would give Blackwell warning and time to cover what's left to cover. He was thinking aloud now, she could tell. We need the banking records. The original transaction logs showing the real payments against the altered invoices. We need documented evidence of the water diversion. Physical, on the ground. We need to find Reeves. Reeves could be anywhere by now. Men don't go as far as they think they do. He looked up. He took no severance, no back pay. That means he left fast, and he left because he was told to, not because he wanted to. People who leave because they're told to, they don't usually go far from the people who told them. They stay close enough to be managed. She thought about that. Laramie, she said. He had a sister in Laramie. He mentioned her sometimes. Cole nodded and wrote it down. He looked at his notes for a moment. Then he looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not the careful assessment of the past few days, something more direct. I need to tell you something, he said. You've been telling me things all evening. This is different. He straightened in his chair. My name, Cole Calloway. It's not just a name I've been hiding under. Before I came to Wyoming, I worked as an investigator out of St. Louis. Private work, mostly, but I had relationships with federal and territorial agencies, fraud cases primarily, land and banking fraud. She waited. 7 years ago, I ran a case out of Kansas involving a land acquisition operation. Similar structure to what's happening here. A group using holding companies, corrupt local officials, falsified records to systematically acquire land from ranching families who couldn't fight back effectively. He paused. We built a case over 14 months. It was solid. It would have brought criminal charges against 15 men, including 2 elected officials. He stopped. What had happened? She said. Someone inside the operation found out we were close to filing. My partner at the time, a man named Daniel Marsh, had gotten access to the internal accounts of the primary holding company. He was the one who finally connected all the entities to a single directing authority. Cole's voice stayed level. They went to his home. His wife was there. He didn't finish the sentence in a way that required finishing. The lamp on the table threw its light in a steady circle. Outside, the Wyoming night was settled and cold and silent. I got out before they could do the same to me, Cole said. But the case collapsed without Daniel's testimony and his records. The men responsible walked. I spent 2 years under different names trying to stay ahead of the ones they sent to clean up the remaining loose end. He met her gaze steadily. Me. Vivian looked at him for a long moment. The men who shot you, she said, on the road. They found me in Colorado. I'd gotten careless. Stayed in one place 3 weeks longer than I should have. He touched the sides of his jaw briefly, unconsciously. I got lucky with the direction of the shot. Another 2 inches and you'd have found a horse at your gate with an empty saddle. She let that sit for a moment. Why are you telling me this now? She said. Because you just told me everything. He said it simply. And because what's happening to your ranch is the same operation, not similar, the same. The holding companies, the method of falsifying records, the use of local officials to insulate against legal challenge. He leaned forward. The man who ran the Kansas operation was never charged. The case collapsed. He's had 7 years to refine the method and move to new territory. You think Blackwell is connected to the Kansas operation? I think Blackwell may be an extension of it, a regional partner or a licensee of the method. The man at the center, the one who directed the Kansas operation, his name was never made public. We only knew him through intermediaries. Cole looked at his notes. But the architecture of what's happening here is too precise to be coincidence. Someone is teaching this. She was quiet. She was thinking. If you reopen this, she said carefully, you stop being just a ranch hand doing an errand. Yes. The people who've been hunting you, they'd know where you are. Yes. She looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them looked away. You understand what you're offering, she said. It wasn't quite a question. I understand what's at stake, both sides of it. He didn't flinch from it. I'm not going to pretend it's easy arithmetic, but I've spent 2 years running from this. And Daniel Marsh, he stopped, started again. He deserved better than what happened. The families in Kansas who lost their land deserved better. And you... He stopped again, shorter. And me, she said quietly. This ranch is yours. You built it alongside your husband. What's happening to it is deliberate and criminal, and the people doing it are counting on you not being able to fight it alone. He met her eyes. You're not alone. The words sat there in the quiet room. Not dramatic, not performed, just a fact, stated plainly by a man who understood the cost of what he was saying. Vivian pressed her hands flat on the table again. That solid ground gesture. All right, she said. Then we do it right. We do it completely. And we don't move until we have enough that they can't walk away from it the way they walked away from Kansas. Cole nodded. Then I need to go to Laramie, he said. When? Soon, 3-4 days. My shoulder needs another few days before I can make a 2-day ride without doing damage I can't afford. He looked at his notes. In the meantime, I need to get into the records room at the courthouse here. The land survey filings, the ones prior filed for the holding companies. There's something in those filings I want to look at more closely. I can get you access. My attorney's office is across the street from the courthouse. I have a reason to be there that wouldn't raise questions. Good. He started to push back from the table. The shoulder caught him halfway and he paused, jaw tightening, then completed the movement. You need to let it heal, she said. It's healing. Faster than is sensible. He looked at her with something close to humor. I've been told I'm not always sensible. Whoever told you that was being kind. She stood, gathered the papers into their organized stacks with quick, careful movements. 4 days. You can use the time here well enough? She picked up the ledger. Hesitated. Cole. He turned back at the door. The partner you lost. Daniel Marsh. How long ago did you say? 7 years? And you've been carrying it since. He didn't answer that with words. He didn't need to. She could see it in the way he stood, not broken, not undone, but carrying. The particular posture of a person who has learned to move with the weight of something rather than trying to put it down. I'm sorry, she said again. Still simple, still enough. He went back to the bunkhouse. She went to bed. She did not sleep well, but she slept. The next 4 days moved differently than the days before. Something had shifted in the architecture of the place, not in how the ranch operated, but in the quality of attention moving through it. Cole was up early every morning, and she was aware of where he was in the way she'd never been aware of where a hired hand was. He was at the records, at the equipment barn, at the fence line. He walked with Ellis in the afternoon, the two of them covering ground, Cole looking at things she'd trained herself to stop noticing because they were familiar. Ellis was good for that, she thought. Ellis was young enough to still see the ranch as interesting rather than habitual. On the second day, Cole asked her about the hands who'd resigned in the year before Thomas died. Not Reeves, the others. 2 men had left in the 8-month window before Thomas's death, both quietly, both without much explanation. She'd assumed normal turnover. Names, Cole said. She gave them. He wrote them down. Reeves was the most valuable, she said. He knew the financial side. The others were field work. Field work matters, Cole said. The water diversion, someone physical did that. Someone who knew the terrain. That's not Reeves's skill set. He looked at the names on his list. One of these 2 men might know where the diversion is located. If I can find physical evidence upstream on the Eastern Springs, I don't need Reeves's testimony about the financial records. I can corroborate the diversion independently. She looked at him. You'd need to ride to the eastern boundary. How far? 2 hours, maybe less, depending on the trail. I can do 2 hours. Not with that shoulder. Vivian. He used her name directly, which he'd only done twice before. I need to get there before the bank representative arrives. If I can document the diversion physically, photographs, measurements, a survey notation, that's evidence the bank's auditor can't dismiss. It directly contradicts the water rights claim, and it shows the audit request is part of a coordinated attack. She pressed her lips together. He wasn't wrong. We go together, she said. He looked at her. I know that land better than anyone alive, she said. You'd spend an hour finding the right tributary. I can take you directly there. He considered arguing. She could see him considering it. Then he evidently decided that the efficiency of having a guide was worth more than whatever point he would be making by arguing. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "before first light." They left in the dark. Nora was awake and handed them each coffee without a word. Corbett watched them saddle up with his usual careful expression and asked no questions, which was one of his qualities she'd always valued. The ride was cold and quiet. Cole rode at a manageable pace that she appreciated without commenting on. She understood it was the shoulder calibrating, not hesitation. They didn't talk much. The land was familiar enough to her that she didn't need to think about it, and he seemed to understand that she needed the quiet to observe. He was looking at everything. She'd noticed this about him, that he was always reading the land the same way he read documents, looking for inconsistencies. The eastern springs fed from a source up a gentle incline about a mile from where the documented boundary ran. She'd ridden this ground hundreds of times. She knew exactly where the water emerged, where it ran, how it pooled before running downslope toward the stock water system. She knew the moment she saw it that something was wrong. "Stop," she said. Cole stopped. She rode forward slowly. The natural channel, she'd known it since childhood, since Thomas first brought her here and showed her the spring that made the eastern quarter viable, ran in a particular path through a slight cut in the rock. She knew how it sounded at this time of year. She knew how the ground looked on either side of it. The ground on the north side of the channel was disturbed in a way that weather alone didn't account for. She dismounted without being asked. Cole followed. She heard him land and heard the brief intake of breath from the shoulder, and they walked forward together. Someone had built a partial diversion structure in the rock cut. Not elaborate, this wasn't engineering. It was a strategic placement of packed earth and fitted stones that redirected approximately a third of the spring's flow through a secondary channel cut into the hillside. The secondary channel ran north, toward the boundary, toward the land that Keystone Holdings now controlled. It had been done carefully. From 30 feet away, it looked like natural rock formation. You had to be standing directly on it to see the joins between the fitted stones, the deliberate compaction of the earth. She stood there looking at it for a moment. "How long?" she said. Cole was crouched beside the structure, looking at the stone joints. He was already reaching into his coat for the small notebook he carried everywhere. The moss coverage on these stones. He examined the edges. This wasn't recent. A year. Probably closer to 14 months. He looked up at her. "Give or take. The moss is established. This was built before the survey claim was filed." Before the survey claim. Which meant it was built before the legal mechanism that was supposed to justify the reduced water flow, built in anticipation of the legal cover that would come afterward. She stood up straight. Her jaw was tight. "They built the diversion first," she said, "then filed the legal claim." Yes. The legal claim was the cover story, designed to give the reduced water supply a documented justification so you couldn't argue it was sabotage. He was sketching the structure in his notebook. "But this is physical evidence. This structure predates the filing. If we can establish the timeline, we can prove the filing was fabricated to conceal deliberate sabotage," she finished. "Yes." She looked at the structure for another moment. Then she looked at the channel, at the clear water moving through both paths, the natural one at 2/3 its proper flow, and the artificial one carrying away what was hers. She picked up a stone and began dismantling the diversion. "Wait," Cole started. "I'm not leaving it standing," she said. The first stone came loose, and she set it aside. "I'm dismantling it after I document it, which you're doing right now." He looked at her for a second, then went back to his notebook. She worked steadily, pulling the structure apart stone by stone, restoring the natural channel to its full flow. It took 20 minutes. The water came back to where it should have been 14 months ago, and she stood there and watched it for a moment, breathing hard from the work, and felt something she recognized as grief, not for the water, but for the time. For 14 months of slow bleeding that had been invisible to her while she was paying attention to everything else. Cole was still writing. He'd moved around the site, making measurements, making notes, documenting the secondary channel. "I need to come back with surveying equipment," he said, "to establish the coordinates officially. But what I have here is enough to show the structure existed and was deliberately placed." She turned back to the horses. "Then let's go." The ride back was faster. The cold had broken somewhat with the climbing sun, and she pushed the pace in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. Halfway back, Cole said, "I'm angry." Yes. 14 months. They sat in their offices and watched my cattle slowly lose condition and my revenue quietly drop, and they... She stopped. Let the silence run for a moment. Thomas would have found it faster. He was better in the field than I am. I think that's partly why they waited until he was gone. Cole was quiet for a moment, riding beside her. You found it, he said. You found it. You took me there. You knew where to look. I didn't. He paused. You've been running this ranch alone for 18 months while someone tried to take it apart piece by piece. You kept 37 employees working and 14,000 acres producing and a railroad contract intact. And you kept enough of the records to build a case. He glanced at her. That's not nothing. She didn't answer. She wasn't sure she believed it entirely, but she heard it, and that was enough. Back at the ranch, they found a horse at the gate she didn't recognize. She exchanged a glance with Cole. His hand moved instinctively toward his hip before he stopped it. Easy, she said, low. Corbett was walking toward them from the yard. Man arrived an hour ago, he said. Said he knows you. Name of Garrison, James Garrison. Says he's an attorney from Denver, she said. She knew the name. Thomas had used James Garrison years ago for a federal land matter, when their claim to the eastern boundary first needed federal documentation. She hadn't spoken to him since Thomas died. He said he needs to talk to you, Corbett continued. Said it was urgent and that he'd ridden from Cheyenne to say it in person. She looked at Cole. How would he know to come here, Cole said, quietly enough for just her. I don't know. She looked at the main house. Let's find out. James Garrison was a small, neat man in his early 60s, with the careful eyes of someone who spent his professional life looking for the thing that wasn't on the page. He was standing in the kitchen with a cup of Nora's coffee when they came in, and he put it down when he saw Cole and looked at him with an expression that had recognition in it. Cole went still. I thought it might be you, Garrison said. Not accusatory, almost relieved. You two know each other, Vivian said. We've corresponded, Garrison said. He looked at Cole carefully. Years ago. Before you... He stopped. Before circumstances changed. Cole's face had gone to the careful neutral she recognized as his processing expression. Why are you here, James? Garrison looked at Vivian. I'm here because a week ago I received a request from the Territorial Bank of Cheyenne to provide a legal assessment of Silver Ridge Ranch's financial standing as a third-party evaluator. He turned back to Cole. The attorney of record on the request was Rutherford Pryor. The kitchen went quiet. Pryor sent the audit request to you specifically, Cole said. He sent it to my firm. I don't think he knew I'd handled federal matters for this ranch years ago, but I did. And when I looked at the name on the property and I looked at what they were asking me to assess, he shook his head. I recognized the structure, the same way I recognized your name, Cole, from correspondence I've kept. He looked at Vivian. I'm not here as Pryor's evaluator. I declined that engagement. I'm here because the woman who owns this ranch deserves to know that someone just tried to use her own legal history against her. Vivian stood at the edge of the kitchen and looked at this small, careful man who had ridden from Cheyenne to tell her something he didn't have to tell her. How much do you know? She said. Enough to know you need someone at the federal level who understands land fraud litigation. He straightened. Enough to know you're running out of time. He looked at Cole. And enough to know that if Cole Calloway is involved, this is bigger than one ranch in Wyoming. Cole and Vivian looked at each other across the kitchen. The moment stretched. Then Cole pulled out a chair and said, Sit down, James. We have a lot to cover and not much time to cover it. Garrison sat. Vivian poured coffee. Nora stood in the corner with the expression she wore when she'd decided to be furniture. Outside, the eastern springs ran at their full volume for the first time in 14 months. The water moved as it was always meant to move, downhill toward the land it belonged to, carrying what it had always carried, patient and unstoppable. Inside, 3 people sat at a kitchen table and began to build the thing that was going to end this. Garrison stayed 3 days. He slept in the room Nora prepared off the main hall, and he was up before dawn each morning, which was when Cole was already at the dining table with his notes, and Vivian was making the first of what would be 4 or 5 cups of coffee she'd drink before the rest of the ranch woke up. The 3 of them fell into a working rhythm that no one designed. It emerged from the shape of what needed doing and the particular way each of them thought. Garrison understood legal architecture the way Cole understood investigative structure, and Vivian understood the ranch's records the way neither of them could. She knew which numbers were wrong because she knew what the right ones felt like. That wasn't a skill she'd thought to value before. Now it was the foundation everything else was being built on. On the first evening, Garrison spread his own documents on the dining table alongside hers. He had, in the 2 days between declining Pryor's engagement and writing to Silver Ridge, pulled everything publicly available on Keystone Land Holdings and Prairie Basin Acquisitions from the Territorial Registry. He'd also sent a wire to a colleague in Kansas, a name he didn't share yet, but whose response he was waiting for. The holding company structure is sophisticated, Garrison said, tracing a line between two documents with his finger. Keystone and Prairie Basin are legally distinct entities with separate registered agents. On paper, there's no connection, but they share an office building in Cheyenne. They filed their formation documents 18 days apart, and the legal language in both charters is nearly identical. He looked at Cole. The same attorney drafted both, not Pryor. Pryor's the face. Someone else drafted the underlying structure. Can you prove that? Cole said. Not yet. But charter language has signatures the way a writer has a voice. I've read enough corporate filings to recognize when two documents came from the same hand. He sat back. What I need is one of the original formation agreements, the full text, not the filed abstract. Those would be in Pryor's records, Vivian said, or in the office of whoever Pryor works for. Garrison looked at her steadily. Do you know who Blackwell uses for his primary legal representation? Not locally, at the territorial level. She thought about it. Thomas had known. He'd researched Blackwell carefully in the early years when the first purchase offer came in, and she remembered him mentioning a firm in Cheyenne that handled Blackwell's major transactions. She dug through the back rooms of her memory. Standish and Crail, she said, out of Cheyenne. Thomas said they handled Blackwell's railroad contracts and his major land transactions. Garrison and Cole looked at each other. Standish and Crail also represented the primary holding company in the Kansas operation, Cole said quietly. The room went still in a particular way. You're sure? Garrison said. I spent 14 months studying that case. I'm sure. Garrison picked up his pen. He was writing faster now. That's the thread. That's the connection we needed. He looked up. If Standish and Crail drafted the holding company structures in both Kansas and Wyoming, and if we can establish that the operating methods in both operations are substantively identical, then we're not looking at a local fraud. We're looking at an organized multi-territorial scheme. That changes the jurisdictional picture entirely. Federal, Vivian said. Federal, Garrison confirmed, which means we go over the heads of Judge Harlan and the county coroner and everyone else Blackwell has managed to reach at the local level. He looked at Cole. But we need the Kansas case reopened. We need the connection established officially. Cole was quiet for a moment. I was looking at the table, not at either of them, and Vivian recognized the expression, not hesitation, the thing that happened before he said something that cost him. The Kansas case collapsed because the evidence was held by Daniel Marsh, he said. When Daniel died, his records were seized by local law enforcement. The official finding was that they were returned to the relevant parties. He paused. They weren't. I know they weren't, because two of the documents Daniel had obtained should have been returned to a federal banking authority, and that authority never received them. Which means they're somewhere, Garrison said, which means someone kept them. Cole looked up. Either to protect themselves from what's in them, or to protect the operation from what's in them. Either way, they exist. Do you know where? I have a theory. He said it carefully, like a man who didn't want to give a theory the weight of a fact before it earned it. Daniel's last communication to me, 2 days before he was killed, he said he'd made copies. He said he'd sent copies to someone he trusted outside the investigation, outside law enforcement, outside anyone connected to the case. Who? Garrison said. He didn't say. He was being cautious about the wire. He said, a woman who keeps things safe. That was all. Cole's jaw tightened briefly. I've thought about that phrase for 7 years. I never identified who he meant. Vivian had been listening. She set her coffee down. Did Daniel Marsh have family? A wife. She left Missouri after he died. I lost track of her. If he trusted someone with those copies, the most likely person is someone close to him. A wife who disappeared after her husband was killed. She met Cole's eyes. She might not have disappeared by choice. Cole looked at her. Something shifted in his face. Not quite the expression she'd been cataloging, something older than that. "I never thought of it that way," he said. "I assumed she ran." "A woman whose husband was killed because of what he knew," Vivian said evenly. "She might have run to stay alive. That's different from running away from the problem." The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. Garrison cleared his throat gently. "If we could locate Mrs. Marsh, and if she has Daniel's copies—" He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Cole was already looking at his notes. "Her name was Ruth. Ruth Marsh. Originally from Indiana, she and Daniel met in St. Louis." He wrote it down. "I'll need to make inquiries. Carefully." "There's someone I can wire," Garrison said. "A colleague in St. Louis who handles estate matters. He'd know how to locate a woman who'd relocated without drawing attention." He paused. "It'll take time." "How much time do we have before the bank representative arrives?" Cole asked Vivian. 6 days. Garrison made a sound that was not quite a sigh. "Then we work with what we have and we use the audit as an opportunity." Both of them looked at him. "The bank representative arrives expecting to find irregularities in Silver Ridge's records," Garrison said. "Records that were tampered with by someone else. But if we've already documented the tampering, if we present the original payment records alongside the altered invoices, and show the bank their own transaction logs contradict the invoices." He spread his hands. "We're not defending against the audit. We're using the audit to demonstrate the fraud." Vivian looked at the stack of altered invoices on the corner of the table. 17 documents, 22 months of careful, patient corruption sitting in a pile. "We'd need the bank's own records," she said, "their transaction logs, to prove the payments match our ledger entries and not the altered invoices." "Which is normally confidential," Garrison said. "But a fraud investigation, even a preliminary one, can compel disclosure." He looked at Cole. "If we can give the bank representative enough credible evidence of tampering on the day they arrive, they have a legal obligation to retain their own records for examination rather than proceeding with the audit as filed." "We flip it," Cole said. "We flip it," Garrison agreed. "Instead of the audit being a weapon against Silver Ridge, it becomes the mechanism by which the fraud is exposed." Vivian looked at the two of them. She looked at the stacks of paper on the table. Her records, Garrison's documents, Cole's notes, all of it layered together into something that was beginning to look less like a defense and more like a case. "What do we need to do in the next 6 days?" she said. They told her. But the work that followed was not dramatic. It was the kind of work that looked like nothing from the outside. Hours at a table, papers moving from stack to stack, handwriting filling pages. Ellis made 3 trips to town on errands that would not have looked suspicious to anyone watching: filing fees, notary stamps, a request at the land office for copies of specific survey documents. Corbett managed the ranch operations without being told to pick up the slack, which was one of his qualities she'd underestimated. He kept the hands working, kept the daily rhythm intact, and asked no questions about what was happening in the main house. Once, passing the dining room door, he caught Vivian's eye through the gap and gave her a look that she understood. "I've got the outside, you handle the inside." She nodded. That was enough. On the second day after Garrison arrived, Cole left for Laramie. He told her that morning at breakfast. Just the two of them. Garrison was still sleeping, which he did until 6, which was apparently a luxury he'd earned. "Reeves," Cole said. "I need to try before we go any further. If Reeves will talk, he's the internal witness. We have the physical evidence at the springs and the financial documentation, but a man who was inside the operation and can testify to being directed to cooperate. That's the difference between a case and a conviction." She looked at him across the table. "You said men don't go as far as they think." "I still believe that. And if Reeves isn't cooperative, then I come back with what I have and we proceed without him." He was drinking his coffee, looking at the table, and she could see him calculating. "But if someone directed Reeves, paid him, or threatened him, or both, then Reeves is as much a victim of this as you are." Man made his choices, but he made them under pressure. People under pressure sometimes want out badly enough to talk. She thought about Martin Reeves, 12 years of reliable service. The man who'd taught her foreman how to read cattle condition by watching how an animal moved rather than how it looked. A man who'd sat at Thomas's table for holiday meals and known the names of her horses. She wanted to be angry at him without qualification and found that she couldn't quite get there. "Be careful," she said. "I will." "I mean it, Cole. If Blackwell's people are watching Reeves—" "I know what careful means," he said. Not dismissive. The voice of someone who has learned the definition through experience they'd rather not have had. She let it go. He left mid-morning with Ellis's cousin's horse because his own was recognizable to anyone who'd been watching the ranch. Small precaution, the kind of thing she was learning to think in now. Small precautions layered into the fabric of ordinary decisions. He came back 36 hours later, earlier than she expected. She heard the horse in the yard at 10 in the evening and went to the door. He dismounted, and she could see from the set of his shoulders, even accounting for the healing shoulder, that something had happened. Not bad exactly, different. She waited until he'd handed the horse to the night hand and come inside. "He was there," Cole said, in the kitchen, with the door closed. "Sister's house, Laramie, 2nd Street east of the rail yard." He sat down. "He's not well. He's been—" He chose the word carefully. "He's frightened. Has been for more than a year. He left Silver Ridge because 2 men came to his room in town one night and told him what would happen if he didn't. To him. To his sister. She's widowed, has 2 children." Cole's expression stayed even, but she could read what was underneath it. "He didn't have good options." "No," she said. "I suppose he didn't. He's not proud of what he did. He spent most of the conversation not quite looking at me." Cole put his hands on the table. "He told me everything, the Keystone Land Holdings connection, the water diversion. He didn't physically build it, but he knew it was being built and he knew who gave the order. A man who works for Blackwell named Terrence Doyle, oversees field operations." He paused. Doyle also supervised the changes to the invoices. He had a contact inside Hollis Supply who made the alterations before the invoices reached Silver Ridge. Someone inside Hollis. A billing clerk named Farrow. Been with Hollis Supply 4 years. Doyle paid him $300 over 18 months to make the alterations. He looked at her. Reeves knew about Farrow because Doyle told him, as leverage, making sure Reeves understood that multiple people were implicated and that talking would cost more than staying quiet. She absorbed this. $300 to alter 17 invoices designed to ruin a woman's ranch and potentially implicate her in fraud. The cheapness of it was somehow worse than the scale. "Will Reeves testify?" she said. "He will?" Cole said it without ceremony, and she understood from his tone that it had not been a simple or easy conversation. "I told him the risk he'd taken by cooperating with them was already documented in the physical evidence. That his testimony wouldn't be the only thing standing between him and legal exposure. It would be one piece of a larger case that had corroboration from multiple directions." He paused. "And I told him that the men who threatened his sister were the kind of men who don't stop at one threat. That the best protection for his family was a completed prosecution, not continued silence." "Do you believe that?" "Yes. And I think he believed it too once he stopped being afraid long enough to think." Cole looked at the lamp on the table. "He's agreed to travel to Cheyenne to make a formal statement to a territorial attorney when we're ready. Not before. We agreed it was safer for him to stay in Laramie until the case was further along." "When will that be?" "When Garrison's colleague in St. Louis finds Ruth Marsh." He met her eyes. "Everything connects. The Kansas operation connects to the Cheyenne structure through Standish and Crail. The Cheyenne structure connects to what happened on this ranch through Doyle and Pryor and the holding companies. And what happened on this ranch, the full picture of it, including what may have happened to Thomas, requires the Kansas case to be formally reopened." He paused. "Ruth Marsh's copies of Daniel's records are the key. If they exist and if she still has them, we have everything." Everything. She turned the word over. It was a large word for something that had started as a ledger with 4 handwritten pages and a stranger bleeding in a saddle. The wire from Garrison's colleague arrived on the 4th day. Garrison read it at the kitchen table with Cole and Vivian on either side of him, and when he finished, he set it down and let out a slow breath. "Ruth Marsh is alive," he said. "She's been living in Indianapolis under her maiden name, Ruth Callender, for the past 6 years. She runs a small boarding house." He paused. "She contacted my colleague's firm 2 years ago inquiring about how to preserve documents of potential legal significance. He'd advised her, and then He shook his head. And then apparently nothing happened, because no case ever materialized, and she kept the documents and went on with her life. Cole had gone very still. She still has them, Vivian said. She still has them. Garrison looked at Cole. My colleague says she's been waiting. She knew what Daniel died for. She's been keeping those records for 6 years waiting for someone to come for them. The kitchen was silent for a moment. Vivian looked at Cole. His face was doing something she hadn't seen before. Not the careful processing expression, not the working ahead look. Something that had been pressed flat for a long time and was trying to find its shape again. She waited, he said, quietly, almost to himself. She waited, Garrison said. Cole stood up from the table. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to them for a moment. Vivian looked at Garrison. Garrison looked at his coffee. When Cole turned back around, his face was composed again, but not in the way it usually was. It was composed in the way of someone who has just put something down that they've been carrying for a very long time and finds that their hands don't quite know what to do without the weight. We need someone to go to Indianapolis, he said. I'll send my colleague, Garrison said immediately. He already has a relationship with her. She'll trust him. Tell him to bring everything, every copy Daniel made, every document. Cole sat back down. And tell him to travel quietly. Garrison was already writing. The bank representative arrived on the 6th day, as promised. His name was Aldrich. He was 42, precise, and had the look of a man who was good at his job and knew it. He came with a junior associate in a leather satchel that he set on Vivian's dining table with the manner of someone who expected the table to be cleared for him. He found Garrison sitting there instead. James Garrison, Garrison said, rising and extending his hand. Federal land fraud litigation, representing Mrs. Ashcroft's interests. We've been expecting you. Aldrich looked at Garrison, looked at the table, which was covered in organized stacks of documents, looked at Cole, who was leaning against the far wall with his arms folded and an expression of patient attention. I'm here to conduct an audit, Aldrich said. You're here to review 30 months of financial records, Garrison said pleasantly. We've prepared them. All 30 months, organized chronologically and cross-referenced against the original bank transaction logs. He gestured to the table. We've also prepared documentation of certain irregularities that we believe you'll want to be aware of before you begin. Aldrich's eyes moved to the stack Garrison was indicating. He was too professional to show alarm, but something shifted in his expression. What kind of irregularities, he said. The kind that suggests the audit request itself may be part of a coordinated effort to misrepresent Silver Ridge Ranch's financial standing for the purpose of facilitating a forced acquisition. Garrison said it at the same conversational pace as everything else. We have physical documentation, witness statements, and financial records that support this characterization. We're prepared to share all of it with you today, and we'd ask that you retain your institution's transaction logs pending a formal fraud investigation. Aldrich looked at him for a long moment. Then he pulled out a chair and sat down. Show me, he said. The meeting lasted 4 hours. Vivian sat at the head of the table and answered questions when they were directed at her, and let Garrison manage the presentation of the evidence, and watched Aldrich's face as he worked through the materials. He was a careful reader. He went back 3 times to the section showing the altered invoices against the original payment records. He asked to see the documentation of the water diversion twice, the sketches and measurements Cole had made at the Eastern Springs. His junior associate took notes and occasionally whispered something to him, and Aldrich would nod or shake his head without looking up from whatever he was reading. At the 2-hour mark, he set down the document he was holding and looked at Vivian directly for the first time. Mrs. Ashcroft, he said, the audit request filed with our institution identified specific discrepancies in Silver Ridge's financial records as the basis for review. The materials you've presented indicate that those discrepancies were deliberately introduced into your records by an external party. He paused. If that's accurate, then the audit request was filed on fraudulent grounds. Yes, she said. That's a serious allegation. It's a serious situation, she said. He looked at her for a moment. She did not look away. He turned to Garrison. Who filed the audit request? An attorney named Pryor, Rutherford Pryor, representing interests connected to Keystone Land Holdings and Prairie Basin Acquisitions. Garrison slid a document across the table. We've documented Pryor's connection to both entities and to Gideon Blackwell, who has made repeated attempts to acquire Silver Ridge Ranch. Aldrich read the document. He turned to his associate. Wire the Home Office. Tell them we have a situation that requires compliance review before we proceed with any audit action. He turned back to Garrison. We'll need to retain all relevant records. We anticipated that, Garrison said, and produced a prepared letter requesting exactly that. Aldrich read it, signed it, and handed it back. When they left, Vivian walked them to the gate because she was that kind of woman. She didn't send people off, she saw them off. And she watched Aldrich ride out with his associate and his leather satchel and the 4 hours of documentation that had just turned his assignment inside out. She turned back to the ranch yard. Cole was standing on the porch. One piece, she said, walking toward him. One piece, he agreed. The bank is neutralized. They won't move against Silver Ridge now, not while a fraud inquiry is pending. But Blackwell doesn't know that yet. No. Cole looked at the gate. And he's expecting results. When Aldrich reports back to whoever requested that audit through unofficial channels, and Blackwell will have someone inside that bank, a low-level contact, the report won't be what they expected. Blackwell will do something, she said. Yes. He looked at her. Scared people make mistakes. You said that back to me once. You said it first, and I believe it. He turned toward the house. Garrison needs to hear how the meeting went. She followed him in. Garrison was still at the table making notes. He looked up when they came in, read their faces, and let out a breath. Good, he said. Good, Vivian confirmed. Now what? Now we wait for Indianapolis, he said. And we watch to see what Blackwell does when the audit doesn't deliver what he planned for. They didn't wait long. The following morning, Corbett came to the door before breakfast. Ryder, he said. Not at the gate. At the north fence, standing there. Not approaching. Cole was on his feet before Corbett finished the sentence. Vivian was right behind him. From the porch, she could see the figure at the north fence line. A man on a gray horse, sitting still, just watching the main house. Far enough to be out of conversation range, close enough to be seen. Cole stood beside her. He said nothing. Blackwell's man, she said. Probably Doyle. Cole's voice was level. Just watching, reporting what they can see from there. Whether the bank representative's visit created any visible change in the operation. Whether there are strangers here. A pause. Whether you look like a woman who's scared or a woman who's working. She stood straight. She looked at the rider at the fence with the particular expression she'd been practicing since Thomas died. Not defiance, not display. Just presence. The presence of a woman on her own land who intended to stay there. The rider watched for 15 minutes, then he turned his horse and rode away. They'll do more than watch, Cole said quietly. I know. When Indianapolis comes through, when we have Daniel's records, we need to move quickly, file with the territorial level before they have time to respond. How quickly? Days, not weeks. He looked at her. Garrison should begin drafting the filing now, against the timeline we have. She nodded. I'll tell him. She went inside. Cole stayed on the porch another moment, watching the empty fence line where the rider had been, and something in the set of his jaw was not quite what it usually was. She noticed it from the doorway, the way a person looks when something is ending. Not the specific thing they're doing at this moment, but a larger something. A chapter. A long, wearing season of running and looking over their shoulder and making themselves small enough to stay alive. She didn't say anything about it. She went inside and told Garrison to start drafting. The east wind came up that afternoon, the way it did in Wyoming when weather was building somewhere out of sight. The hands pulled their collars up and went about their work. The cattle moved in the way cattle moved when the temperature was dropping. Slow, deliberate, not alarmed. The ranch worked on, as it had always worked on. Inside, Garrison wrote. Cole sat with his notes. Vivian looked at the ledger she'd kept, 5 pages growing into something larger now, a document of what had been done to her ranch and what she'd done in return, and wrote the date at the top of the next blank page. She left the rest of it empty, for now. There was still more to fill in. The documents from Indianapolis arrived 11 days later. Garrison's colleague, a methodical man named Aldous Hett, who communicated exclusively by wire and formal letter, sent word ahead that he was traveling personally rather than trusting the package to a courier service. He arrived at Silver Ridge on a Tuesday morning in a hired buggy from town, a slim leather case on the seat beside him, and he handled that case with the careful attention of someone transporting something that had been kept safe for a long time and deserved to arrive that way. Ruth Marsh's copies were complete. More complete, in fact, than anyone had expected. Daniel Marsh had been a thorough man, and in the 2 weeks before his death, he had apparently understood that thoroughness was the only insurance available to him. The package contained copies of internal financial records from the primary Kansas holding company, correspondence between the directors of that company and the Standish and Crail law firm in Cheyenne, a handwritten ledger in Daniel's own hand documenting 14 months of investigative findings with dates, names, and source notations, and a single sealed envelope addressed to Calloway, which Ruth had kept sealed for 7 years because the name on the outside was the name her husband had told her to find. Het put the case on the dining table and stepped back. Cole picked up the envelope. The room was quiet. Vivian, Garrison, Het. Nora standing in the kitchen doorway because she'd given up pretending she wasn't part of this. Cole opened it. He read it standing up. It wasn't long. When he finished, he held it at his side for a moment, looking at the middle distance, and then he set it on the table face down, which told Vivian it was private, and she didn't try to read it. He knew, Cole said. He'd identified the central authority, the man directing the operation across both territories. He looked at Garrison. It's in the ledger, with documentation. Garrison was already opening the leather case. The name in Daniel Marsh's ledger was not Gideon Blackwell. Blackwell was in it, documented as the Wyoming regional operator, the man on the ground who identified properties, cultivated local connections, and executed the acquisition process. But the structure above him was larger and older, and the man at its center was a financier based in Denver named Harcourt Vane, who had been quietly orchestrating land acquisitions across 5 territories for 11 years through a network of regional operators, compliant attorneys, and falsified legal structures. Vane's name appeared in connection with Standish and Crail. His investment capital appeared in the formation documents for Keystone and Prairie Basin. His correspondence with Blackwell, copied and annotated by Daniel Marsh, described Silver Ridge Ranch by name as a priority target 18 months before Thomas Ashcroft died. Vivian read that line twice. Garrison read it and went very still. This is a federal conspiracy case, he said. This isn't one fraudulent audit or one corrupt county judge. This is 11 years of organized criminal enterprise across multiple territories. He looked at Cole. This is the case. Yes, Cole said. We need to file with the Federal Territorial Court in Cheyenne. Immediately. Before Vane or Blackwell have any indication that this material exists. He turned to Het. Can you draft the primary filing? I can have it ready in 48 hours, Het said. 24, Garrison said. Het considered this. I'll need coffee and somewhere quiet. Nora pointed him toward Thomas's old office without being asked. The next 24 hours were the strangest of the whole strange month. The ranch operated normally outside. Inside, 2 attorneys worked in shifts, Garrison drafting and Het reviewing, trading pages across the desk in Thomas's office, with the focused economy of men who understood that what they were building had to be structurally sound before anything else. Cole sat with them for the first 8 hours, answering questions, locating specific documents in the growing organized pile, making sure the connections between Kansas and Wyoming were explicit and sourced at every point. Vivian fed everyone. It was not a trivial contribution. 3 men working through the night required food at unpredictable intervals, and Nora was 61 and had earned the right to sleep, so Vivian managed the kitchen herself. Coffee, bread, cold meat, soup kept warm on the back of the stove. She moved between the kitchen and the dining table and the office in a circuit that was practical and kept her from sitting still long enough to feel the full weight of what was happening. Around 2 in the morning, Cole found her in the kitchen. She was standing at the counter with a cup of coffee she'd poured and forgotten about, looking at the window which showed nothing but her own reflection in the dark glass. You should sleep, he said. So should you. Garrison doesn't need me for the next few hours. He came to stand at the counter, not directly beside her, slightly at an angle, which she'd noticed was how he positioned himself in enclosed spaces, giving people room. He's in his element. Het is good. They'll have it. She looked at the dark window for a moment. The line in Daniel's ledger, she said. Silver Ridge named as a priority target 18 months before Thomas died. Yes, That means Thomas was still alive when they identified this ranch. Yes. She turned her coffee cup in both hands. They didn't wait for him to die naturally. Cole was quiet. I've thought that for 18 months, she said. I've thought it alone without saying it out loud, because saying it out loud made it something I'd have to act on, and I didn't know how. She looked at Cole. Thomas's saddle. I never looked at it. It's still in the equipment barn. I put it there after he died, and I haven't touched it. Cole held her gaze. Tomorrow, he said, after we file. We look at it together, and whatever it shows, we document it and we add it to the record. And if it shows nothing, then it shows nothing, but you'll know you looked. She nodded. She drank the coffee, which was cold. The letter, she said. The one Daniel left for you. You don't have to tell me what it said. I know. But if you wanted to... He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had come up again, moving through the yard in the way Wyoming wind did at night. Not hostile, just large. He said he was sorry he didn't tell me sooner about the copies, Cole said. He said he didn't want to put me in danger by telling me too much. A pause. He said he trusted me to finish it. He looked at the window. That's all. She didn't say anything. She understood that some things didn't need responding to. Sometimes a person told you something, not because they needed a response, but because they'd been carrying it alone, and the weight of it was better with one other person knowing. She refilled her coffee and poured one for him. They stood at the counter for a while in the quiet kitchen, not talking, while the attorneys worked in the room down the hall, and the ranch slept outside and the wind moved through the dark yard. Garrison filed the case with the Federal Territorial Court in Cheyenne 31 hours later. He went in person with Het, with the full package of documentation including Daniel Marsh's original records, the physical evidence from the Eastern Springs, the altered invoices against the original bank transaction logs, Martin Reeves's signed statement, which Garrison had traveled to Laramie to obtain formally while Het continued drafting, and a comprehensive brief connecting Harcourt Vane, Standish, and Crail, Gideon Blackwell, and their network of holding companies to 11 years of organized land fraud across 5 territories. Vivian did not go to Cheyenne for the filing. She stayed at Silver Ridge. Cole stayed with her. They looked at Thomas's saddle that morning while Garrison was on the road. It was in the equipment barn exactly where she'd put it, on a rack in the back, under a canvas cover that had gathered dust in the way things did when you were avoiding them. She pulled the canvas off herself. Cole examined the saddle without touching it first, walking around it slowly, looking at it from multiple angles in the morning light coming through the barn door. Here, he said after a while. She came to look. On the left side of the saddle were the girth strap attached to the tree. The leather had been cut partially through. Not all the way. That would have been obvious. A partial cut, deep enough that the stress of a rider's weight at a trot or canter would complete the break. The cut was angled inward and covered by the natural fold of the leather, invisible unless you were looking for it. Vivian looked at it for a long time. She put her hand on the saddle tree, not on the cut, just on the worn leather of the seat that Thomas had ridden for 6 years. She stood like that for a moment. He didn't fall, she said. The girth went. The saddle shifted and he went with it. Yes. And the horse didn't spook. The horse was fine. The horse came home. Her voice was steady. It was the steadiness of someone who is feeling something too large to let into their voice all at once. Thomas was a good enough rider that a spooked horse wouldn't have thrown him on flat ground. But a failed girth, that would take anyone. Yes. She straightened. She took her hand off the saddle. Document it. He did. He measured the cut, described it in writing, sketched it with the same care he'd brought to the spring diversion. She witnessed the documentation and signed her name to it. They added it to the record. It was not proof of who had cut the strap. That would require more. A connection to Doyle, or to one of the other hands who'd left in that window of time, established through testimony or evidence they didn't yet have. But it was proof the saddle had been sabotaged. It was proof Thomas's death was not an accident. And it was now part of a federal case that included the financial fraud, the water diversion, the altered invoices, and 11 years of criminal enterprise stretching across 5 territories. It would be enough. Garrison had told her that, and she believed him. She covered the saddle again and walked out of the barn into the morning light. The federal investigators arrived in Wyoming 3 weeks after the filing. There were 4 of them, out of the territorial court in Cheyenne, and they worked with the quiet efficiency of people who had a complete case in hand and needed only to execute it. Gideon Blackwell was served with a federal fraud indictment on a Thursday morning at his ranch house. His attorney, not Pryor, who'd been separately served the same morning, arrived from Cheyenne by the afternoon and spent 4 hours with Blackwell before emerging to announce that his client would be cooperating with the investigation. Cooperation, in this context, meant Blackwell providing testimony against Harcourt Vane in exchange for a reduced exposure. It was not a noble choice. It was the arithmetic of a man who understood that the case against him was complete, and that the only remaining question was how much of what followed he could redirect toward someone above him. He redirected a great deal. Vane's financial structure, the full network of operators across the 5 territories, the directing role of Standish and Crail. Blackwell knew all of it because he'd been inside it for 9 years, and he gave it in detail. Rutherford Pryor, facing his own indictment, gave his records and his correspondence and the original formation documents for both holding companies, confirming what Garrison had inferred from the charter language. Both entities had been drafted by the same hand, a senior partner at Standish and Crail, who was the primary legal architect of Vane's operation. Terrence Doyle, the man who had overseen the field operations, the water diversion, the corrupted invoices, the threats to Martin Reeves, was arrested in Cheyenne 2 days after Blackwell was served. He did not cooperate. It didn't matter much. The physical evidence and Reeves's testimony were sufficient. Judge Harlan Bates and Coroner Aldous Fletcher were investigated by a separate territorial commission. Fletcher's examination of Thomas had been deliberately incomplete, a fact established through comparison with standard coroner's procedure and confirmed by a medical examiner who examined his records and found that he had never checked the TAC. Harlan Bates had received payments from Pryor's firm over 3 years, documented in Pryor's own records. Both men resigned their positions. Both faced formal proceedings. Harcourt Vane was arrested in Denver on a Thursday afternoon in late spring at his office, in front of his staff, which was not accidental. The federal investigators had chosen the time and place deliberately, and Garrison had quietly suggested it. A man who had spent 11 years making people disappear quietly, making their land transfer without noise, making everything look like ordinary misfortune. That man deserved to be seen in handcuffs in his own building. It wasn't vengeance, it was accuracy. It was the record correcting itself in public. The charges against Vane covered all 5 territories. They would take years to fully prosecute. But the structure of the case was sound, the evidence was documented, and the man at the center of it was no longer free to direct anything. Silver Ridge Ranch's loan was formally cleared of the fraudulent audit action. The bank, now facing its own regulatory examination for having processed a fraudulent audit request, moved quickly to restore Vivian's credit standing and formally apologize in writing, which Garrison framed and left on her desk as a joke she actually appreciated. The land claims filed by Keystone Holdings were vacated. The water rights dispute was closed in Silver Ridge's favor. The Eastern Springs ran at full volume, as they had before anyone had decided that her ranch was worth destroying. The family that had sold their land to Prairie Basin Acquisitions at 40 cents on the dollar received a judgment entitling them to the difference. They didn't get their land back. That process was more complicated and would take longer, but they would not be left with nothing. Vivian heard about Vane's arrest from Garrison, who wired from Cheyenne. She was in the yard when Ellis brought her the wire, standing near the water trough, watching a new group of cattle being moved into the east pasture that was now fully watered again, that had regained the capacity it had been slowly drained of for 14 months. She read the wire. She folded it and put it in her coat pocket. Ellis was watching her face the way young men watch the faces of people they respect when important news arrives, trying to understand what the right response looks like. "Good news?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Go back to what you were doing." She walked to the fence and stood there looking at the cattle moving through the east pasture gate. They moved the way healthy cattle moved, not hurried, not stressed, just taking the ground that was offered to them. She thought about Thomas. She thought about the saddle in the barn and the clean cut in the leather and the flat ground where they'd found him. She thought about what it meant to have that confirmed, not as resolution exactly, because there was no resolution for losing a person, but as truth, as the record being accurate. Thomas had not been careless. He had not been unlucky. He had been targeted by men who understood that the fastest way to take a ranch was to take the person running it. He deserved to be known accurately. That was what she thought, standing at the fence in the spring sun. Not that anything was fixed or returned, it wasn't, but that the lie was gone. The version of his death that made it ordinary and accidental no longer existed in the official record. What existed now was the truth, imperfect and incomplete in some legal details, but true in its essential shape. She stayed at the fence for a while. Cole found her there, the way he often found her, without announcement, appearing at a reasonable distance and letting her acknowledge him in her own time. "You heard," he said. "Garrison wired." She didn't look away from the pasture. "It's done. The prosecution will go on for a while." "I know, but the part where they could still do something to this ranch is done." She looked at him then. "You can stop sleeping with your revolver on the table?" He looked at her with that expression she'd cataloged over months now, the one that sat between humor and something more serious. "Old habit," he said. "Old habits end." She turned from the fence. "What do you want to do?" He'd known the question was coming. She could tell from the way he didn't look surprised. "I've been thinking about that," he said. "And?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the calculating quiet, something else. The quiet of a person who has arrived somewhere they didn't expect to arrive and is trying to understand what the ground feels like under their feet. "The ranching families who were hit in Kansas," he said. "Most of them lost their land. The case being reopened will result in judgments, but judgments take time, and some of them don't have the resources to wait." He looked at the pasture. "Garrison thinks there's a legal mechanism to accelerate the asset recovery from Vane's holdings, but someone would need to work with those families. Understand their specific situations. Build the individual cases that feed into the larger recovery." She understood where this was going. "That's investigative work." "It's what I know how to do." He looked at her. "But it would mean being in one place for a sustained period, having an address, not running." He paused. "Wyoming is a reasonable location for that kind of work, central to the territories involved." She looked at him for a long moment. "Cole Calloway," she said. "Are you telling me you want to stay?" "I'm telling you I have reasons to stay." He held her gaze. "That's different from asking permission, but Silver Ridge has been my base of operation for 3 months. I thought it was appropriate to say the decision out loud rather than just continue. Rather than just not leaving." "Yes." She thought about what it would mean. Not the romantic architecture of it. She was 57 years old and had survived enough to be done with that kind of thinking, but the practical reality. A man with Cole Calloway's skills and his particular way of seeing things, working out of a ranch, taking cases that protected people who couldn't protect themselves. The work that Daniel Marsh had died trying to do, continued by the person who'd been trying to honor that ever since. She thought about the empty 5th page in her ledger, the one she'd been filling in for 3 months. "The bunkhouse room is too small," she said. "If you're going to be here for more than a season, you should use the north room off the main hall. It has a proper desk." He looked at her. "Garrison's colleague used it," she said. It was empty before that." "Vivian, I'm not making a declaration," she said plainly. "I'm offering a room with a desk to a man who works with papers and needs adequate light." She held his gaze. "Whatever else we are or aren't, we can figure that out in the ordinary course of time. I'm 57. I have no interest in rushing at things." He looked at her for a moment, that direct, unhurried look that had, she'd realized sometime in the past 2 months, become one of the things she depended on without quite deciding to. "All right," he said. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Fix the north fence section that Corbett's been putting off since February." He almost smiled. "Yes, ma'am." Oh. Spring settled into summer. The work of the ranch continued in the way ranch work always continued, without regard for what had happened or who had been vindicated. Cattle needed managing, fences needed checking, contracts needed honoring. The hands worked. Corbett supervised. Ellis grew incrementally more capable in the way young men did when they were paying attention. Cole fixed the north fence. He was not efficient at physical fence work. It was not his skill set, but he was methodical, and Corbett helped without being asked, and the section was done in 2 days. He set up the north room off the main hall with a desk and 2 filing cabinets and a lamp positioned for adequate light. He received correspondence from Garrison, from Het, from the federal investigators in Cheyenne. He traveled twice to Kansas over the summer, spending a week each time meeting with families whose land had been taken. He came back quieter from those trips than when he left, which she understood and didn't press on. Martin Reeves sent a letter in July. It was addressed to Vivian, and it was not long. He said he understood if she never wished to hear from him again. He said he had not been a good man when it mattered, and he was sorry for it. He said he hoped the ranch was doing well because he had always loved Silver Ridge, even when he'd been helping to destroy it. He did not ask for anything. She read it twice and then wrote back. It was not a forgiving letter exactly. It was honest, which she thought was more valuable and more difficult. She told him what the investigation had found. She told him the case was proceeding. She told him she believed people were capable of being worse than they wanted to be under sufficient pressure, and that this did not make it acceptable, and that she hoped he found a way to live with his choices that was more useful than punishing himself indefinitely. She did not invite him back to Wyoming. She mailed the letter and felt afterward the particular lightness of something put in its proper place. Garrison came back to Silver Ridge in September with the first set of judgments from the federal case. They sat at the dining table again, the same table where the whole thing had been built, and he went through the documents with them. Blackwell's ranching operations had been placed into receivership pending full investigation. The receivership would likely result in liquidation, with proceeds directed to the fraud judgments. Vane's considerable assets were frozen. His legal team was attempting to contest the territorial court's jurisdiction, an effort Garrison described as thorough and ultimately futile. The Ashcroft investigation, specifically the evidence related to Thomas's death, had been referred to a separate proceeding examining the full extent of Doyle's field operations. Doyle remained uncooperative, but the physical evidence from the saddle, combined with testimony from one of the former hands who'd quietly come forward after Blackwell's arrest, had established sufficient basis to classify Thomas's death as a homicide. There would be no criminal trial. Doyle's attorneys were negotiating to add it to his existing fraud exposure, but the classification was official. The record was accurate. Vivian received this information the way she received most difficult things, quietly, with her hands flat on the table, looking at the document until she'd read it fully. Garrison sat across from her and didn't say anything, which was the right call. Cole was beside her, not touching her, just present, which was also the right call. After a while, she said, Thomas would have found this infuriating. The fraud more than anything else. He was meticulous about records. He would have hated that someone used his own operations records against it. Garrison allowed a careful smile. The records ultimately worked in your favor. Yes. She picked up her coffee. That's what he would have said too. She thought about Thomas at that table. The actual Thomas. Not the accumulation of grief she'd been carrying, but the man who'd sat at this same table and talked about water rights and cattle prices and railroad contracts with the focused pleasure of someone who genuinely loved the work, who had brought her here to the Eastern Springs when they were newly married and shown her where the water came from, as if showing her something sacred, who had been, in the end, killed because someone decided his ranch was worth more than his life. She had loved him imperfectly, as people do. They had argued about money and about land decisions, and once, memorably, about a dog she'd bought without consulting him that he'd been irritated about for 3 weeks and then become openly devoted to. He had been stubborn in ways that were sometimes useful and sometimes weren't. She had been, as he'd told her more than once, difficult to surprise and harder to persuade. They had built Silver Ridge together, and it was hers, and she intended to keep it. Thank you, James, she said, for writing from Cheyenne to tell me something you didn't have to tell me. Everything that followed started with that. Garrison looked slightly embarrassed, which was not his usual expression. I'm an officer of the court, he said. When I saw what was happening, you could have stayed out of it, and you didn't. She looked at him steadily. That matters. He nodded, accepting it. The wedding was in October, when the aspens had gone gold, and the light in Wyoming had the particular quality it only had for a few weeks each year, low and clear and honest, illuminating everything without flattering it. It was not a large event. Vivian had not wanted large. She told Cole in August, in the kitchen at 7 in the morning, that she thought they should get married before the weather turned, said it with the same directness she'd told him. The north room had a desk, and he'd looked at her for a moment with that expression she'd been cataloging all year and said yes in the same tone she'd said it, plain, certain, without performance. They were married in the ranch yard by the territorial judge who'd replaced Harlan Bates, who was a woman named Claire Adler from Laramie, who had a handshake like a man twice her size and a manner of conducting the proceeding that was efficient and warm in equal measure. The hands were there. Nora stood beside Vivian and cried in the contained way she did everything, quietly, with dignity, and then was done. Garrison attended, and Het and Ellis, who had grown 6 inches in confidence over the past year, and who stood very straight as if the occasion required it. Corbett shook Cole's hand afterward with both of his, which was Corbett's version of a speech. Thomas Ashcroft's name remained on the original ranch deed, as Vivian had always intended. Cole's name was added beside hers. The document sat in the filing cabinet in the office that had been Thomas's and was now both of theirs, and it said what was true. Silver Ridge Ranch had belonged to the Ashcrofts, and it still did, and it also belonged now to something new that hadn't existed before. A freezing night when a wounded man arrived at the gate and a woman decided to open it. She thought about that decision sometimes, about how small it had looked from the outside, a gate, a stranger, a choice that could have gone either way. She'd heard Thomas's voice in her head that night, which was where she still heard it sometimes. You can afford to be generous, you always could. Don't let fear talk you out of it. She had not let fear talk her out of it. This was what she thought about, later, when people asked her how it happened, how Silver Ridge survived what should have ended it, how a woman alone on 14,000 acres held off a coordinated attack by men with more resources and more legal influence and more patience than most people had. She didn't have a tidy answer, because there wasn't one. What she had was this. She had paid attention. She had kept records when keeping records felt pointless. She had asked for help when asking felt like admission of weakness, and turned out to be the opposite of that. She had opened a gate in the dark to someone bleeding and trusted something older and less definable than logic, and that person had turned out to be exactly what the situation required, not because he was perfect, which he wasn't, not because he always knew what to do, which he often didn't, but because he was honest and thorough, and he had his own history of loss that made him understand hers. Hers people survived things not by being without fear, but by choosing well in spite of it, by building something with their hands and protecting it with their records and standing at their gate with the expression of a woman on her own land. She believed that. She had the ranch to prove it. Woken. The following spring, Cole came back from a week in Kansas with a look she recognized, the quieter version of himself that those trips produced. She waited until the 3rd day, when they were riding the north fence together at dusk, the way they'd taken to doing when the weather allowed. "Tell me," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "The Driscoll family, they lost 400 acres, 3 generations on that land." He watched the fence line. "The judgment gives them money. It doesn't give them back what they built." "No," she said. "It doesn't. I don't know how to fix that part." "You can't fix that part." She looked at him. "You can make sure the record is right. You can make sure the people who did it are accountable. That's not nothing." She paused. "It's not everything, but it's not nothing." He rode beside her without answering, which was his way of accepting something he wasn't ready to say out loud. The fence ran straight ahead of them in the evening light, repaired and sound. The land on either side of it was Silver Ridge's, had always been, was now confirmed to be in every document and court record and legal filing that existed. 14,000 acres of Wyoming high country that a group of careful, patient criminals had spent years trying to take and hadn't. She thought, as she sometimes thought, that the land didn't know any of that. The land was indifferent to who claimed it, or fought for it, or built their lives around it. The aspens went gold in October regardless. The springs ran in the spring regardless. The cattle grazed according to their own concerns. What wasn't indifferent was the people on it. The hands who'd stayed through 18 months of pressure because they recognized this as a place worth staying. Corbett, who'd protected the outside while she handled the inside. Ellis, who'd carried messages without knowing the full weight of what he was carrying and done it reliably anyway. Nora, who'd been furniture when furniture was needed and herself when herself was what was called for. And Cole, who had arrived at her gate not looking for a home and had found, as people sometimes found things, what he hadn't known he was looking for. Not because the ranch was beautiful, which it was, or because the life was easy, which it wasn't, but because the woman who ran it had looked at him bleeding in a saddle and seen not a problem to be managed or a risk to be assessed, but a person who deserved a drink of water and a chance to choose his own next step. He'd chosen. So had she. Not once, but repeatedly, in the small accumulation of daily choices that turned out to be what a life was actually made of. The fence ran on ahead of them in last light. The horses moved at a comfortable walk. The land held them the way land held anyone who knew how to be still on it, firmly, without sentiment, without promise beyond the present moment. That was enough. That had always been enough. She touched her heels to her horse and moved a little faster, and he came alongside her, and Silver Ridge opened up ahead of them in the evening, whole and undiminished, going on.